The bidding room went silent the moment the auctioneer read out the final lot number, and that silence told me everything I needed to know before he even said a word. My name is Ethan Cross, and I had exactly 31 credits to my name when I walked into that auction hall on the trading station Kelvex 9. I was not there to buy a ship. I was there to sell scrap metal from a cargo hauler engine I had pulled apart the week before, hoping to make enough to cover my docking fees before the station authorities impounded my shuttle. Debt collectors on Kelvex 9 did not send polite letters. They sent enforcers with magnetic clamps and short tempers, and I had already dodged 2 of them that morning. The auction hall was packed with buyers from a dozen different systems. Insectoid traders from the Threll cluster clicked their mandibles as they compared notes on cargo freighters. A pair of tall, silver-skinned Vantori argued quietly over a mining vessel 2 rows ahead of me. Everyone wanted something shiny, something fast, something with a warranty. Nobody wanted lot number 47. I only noticed it because the auctioneer, a nervous-looking Corvani, with 4 eyes and a voice like grinding gravel, seemed to want to skip past it entirely. Lot 47, he said, barely glancing at his notes. Unregistered heavy vessel, salvage class, non-functional according to station scanners. Sold as is, no warranty, no refunds. Opening bid, 5 credits. Nobody moved. A few buyers actually laughed. I turned around in my seat to look at the viewing screen mounted above the stage, and what I saw made my chest tighten in a strange way I could not explain at the time. The ship was enormous. Even through the grainy holographic projection, I could tell it dwarfed every other vessel in the auction yard. Its hull was blackened in long streaks, like something had scorched it centuries ago and it had simply never been cleaned. There were no elegant curves, no polished plating, none of the sleek design language that every other species in the galaxy seemed to favor. This thing looked like it had been built by someone who did not care how it looked, only how much punishment it could take, and how much it could dish out in return. Scanners can't even read half its systems, the Corvani auctioneer muttered, almost apologetically. Tech signature doesn't match anything in the registry. Could be pre-collapse junk. Could just be junk. Buyer beware. A Vantori trader near the front called out, "Is it even flight capable?" Unknown, the auctioneer admitted. Tow beam brought it in from the outer debris field 3 months ago. Nobody's claimed it, nobody's identified it, and frankly, station management wants it gone. It's taking up a berth we need. Laughter rippled through the hall again. Someone in the back shouted that they would not take it for free, let alone pay for it. The Vantori trader shook his head and turned back to his conversation about the mining vessel. Within a few seconds, the entire room had lost interest in Lot 47, the way a crowd loses interest in a joke that has already been told twice. I do not know exactly why I raised my hand. Maybe it was because I had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was because something about the shape of that ship, buried under all that scorched plating, looked less like wreckage and more like a fist that had been clenched for a very long time. Whatever the reason, I raised my hand and said the only thing I could afford to say. 5 credits. The auctioneer blinked all 4 of his eyes at me, clearly surprised that anyone had bid at all. 5 credits from the human. Do I hear 6? Nobody answered. The room had already moved on, buyers whispering to each other about the next lot, a supposedly pristine passenger transport that everyone actually wanted. I sat there with my hand still half raised, waiting for someone to outbid me, half hoping they would, because 5 credits was still 5 credits I did not really have to spare. 6? Anyone? No? Going once. Silence. Going twice. A Threll trader near me leaned over and whispered something to his companion, and they both chuckled, glancing at me like I was the punchline of a joke I had not been told. I felt my face go warm, but I kept my hand up anyway. Sold. To the human in row 12. For 5 credits, plus the standard 10-credit salvage registration fee. Congratulations, you now own a very large paperweight. More laughter. I paid the 15 credits total, every last coin I had, and signed the transfer documents on a cracked data pad that the auctioneer's assistant shoved in front of me without even making eye contact. Nobody at that auction thought I had made a good decision. A few people actually offered me sympathetic looks, the kind you give someone who has just lost a bet badly. I did not know it yet, but I had just become the only human being in that entire sector who owned a piece of history the galaxy had spent centuries trying to forget. The walk from the auction hall to the docking yard took almost 20 minutes, and the whole way there I kept telling myself I had made a mistake. 15 credits was not a fortune, but it was everything I had, and I had spent it on a ship that station scanners could not even read properly. For all I knew, I had just bought a hollow shell that would be more useful, melted down for parts than flown anywhere. The docking yard supervisor, a heavy-set Vantori named Grell, met me at the gate with a data slate and an expression that suggested he had seen a lot of bad decisions in his time and was mentally filing mine among the worst. "You're the one who bought 47, he said. It was not a question. "That's me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Tow crew's waiting at berth 9. "I'll be honest with you, kid. I've had that thing sitting in my yard for 3 months and I still don't know what it is. Scanners can't get a read on the hull composition. Can't get a read on the power core, if there even is one. Half my crew thinks it's cursed. And the other half?" Grell shrugged his massive shoulders. "The other half thinks it's just old. Real old. Older than anything else that's come through this station in my lifetime. Whatever it is, it's yours now. Try not to blow up my docking yard when you tow it out." The berth was on the far edge of the station, past rows of gleaming cargo haulers and passenger shuttles that made my new purchase look even more out of place. When I finally saw it up close, through the observation window of the tow control room, I understood why the entire auction hall had laughed. It was a wreck. That was the honest truth. Long streaks of black scarring ran across its hull like old wounds that had never properly healed. Sections of exterior plating were dented and warped, though I noticed, even then, that nothing had actually punched through. Whatever had happened to this ship, it had taken a beating and simply refused to break. The tow crew attached magnetic clamps to the hull and slowly guided it away from the station, out toward the small maintenance orbit I had rented with the last of my credit line, a favor from a station administrator who owed me for fixing his personal shuttle months earlier. It took almost 3 hours to get the ship into a stable position, and the entire time I sat in the tow control room, watching that massive dark shape drift through the void, feeling less like a proud new owner, and more like a man who had just adopted a very large, very silent stray animal that might or might not be alive. When the tow crew finally disengaged and left, I was alone with it for the first time. I boarded through a maintenance hatch on the ship's underside, the only entry point the tow crew could get open without cutting through the hull. My handheld scanner gave me almost nothing useful, just vague warnings about unidentified power signatures and a persistent error message that translated roughly to system architecture not recognized. I remember standing in that narrow airlock corridor, my breath fogging slightly in the recycled air, wondering if I had just wasted the last of my money on a tomb. The interior was dark, lit only by the thin beam of my handheld light. The corridors were wider than anything I had ever seen on a standard vessel, built for people much larger than me, or perhaps simply built without any concern for saving space. Thick metal ribs ran along the ceiling and walls, giving the whole place the feel of walking inside the skeleton of some enormous creature rather than a machine. I moved carefully, checking every few steps for structural damage, for leaking coolant, for anything that might suggest the ship was about to fall apart around me. Instead, I found something stranger. Everything was intact. Dusty, dark, silent, but intact. Whole sections of the ship looked untouched by whatever catastrophe had left those scorch marks on the outer hull, as if the damage had all been absorbed on the surface, never allowed to reach whatever lived inside. I found what I assumed was the bridge, after almost 40 minutes of careful exploration. A wide chamber at the front of the ship with rows of dark control panels, and a single elevated chair facing what must have once been a viewport, though it was currently sealed behind thick metal shielding. I ran my light over the panels, half expecting to find nothing but dead circuitry. Then my light caught something on the floor near the chair. A small metal plate bolted into the deck, its surface worn but still legible. I crouched down and wiped away a thin layer of dust with my sleeve, and beneath the grime, I found lettering in a script I recognized immediately, because it was the same script I had grown up reading. It was English. My hands actually shook as I read the words engraved into that plate. I could not make out all of it. Some of the letters were too worn, but I could read enough. A designation, a date, and beneath both of those, a single word that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Command. I had heard the old stories, of course. Everyone had. Humanity had a history that predated most of the current galactic community. A history that got vaguer and more contradictory the further back you tried to trace it. Most alien historians agreed that humans had once been part of a larger interstellar presence, centuries ago, before some unspecified catastrophe scattered human settlements and left most of known space with only fragments of the story. Nobody talked about it much. It was old news, ancient history, the kind of thing you might mention in a bar over a drink but never expected to actually encounter. I had certainly never expected to buy a piece of it for 15 credits. I stood slowly, my light sweeping across the darkened bridge, and for the first time since boarding, I felt something other than nervousness. I felt curiosity, sharp and insistent, pulling me forward the way it always had, ever since I was a kid taking apart old machines just to see how they worked. I made my way toward the chair, stepping carefully over a thick cable that ran along the floor, and that was when I noticed something I had missed before. A small, dark panel embedded in the armrest of the chair, its surface smooth and unmarked, except for a faint outline that looked almost like a handprint. I do not know what made me place my hand against it. Curiosity, I suppose, or maybe something closer to instinct, the kind of pull you feel when you already sense something important is about to happen, even before you understand why. The moment my palm touched the panel, a low hum spread through the deck beneath my feet. So faint at first I thought I had imagined it. Then a single light flickered to life on the console beside the chair, a soft amber glow that pulsed once, twice, then steadied. I stumbled back a step, my heart pounding, my scanner suddenly screaming with readings it had not been able to detect just moments earlier. Power levels climbing, systems activating one by one across the ship, section by section, like a great sleeping creature finally beginning to stir after a very long rest. Somewhere deep in the hull, something that had been silent for longer than I could imagine was waking up, and I realized, standing there in the dark with my hand still hovering over that panel, that whatever I had just bought for 15 credits, it was not scrap. It was not even close to scrap. The lights did not stop at the bridge. I stood frozen for a long moment, as the amber glow spread outward from the console, racing along thin channels in the deck plating like veins carrying blood back into a body that had been still for far too long. Through the soles of my boots I could feel a vibration building, low and steady, the unmistakable hum of something enormous coming back to life beneath me. My scanner was practically useless now, flooded with more data than it could process, numbers scrolling too fast to read. I shoved it into my jacket pocket and grabbed the edge of the command chair to steady myself as the deck gave a gentle shudder. Then a voice spoke, and I nearly fell over backward. Command authority detected. Biometric confirmation in progress. The voice was calm, clear, and entirely too composed for the situation, speaking English with a smoothness that made my chest tighten all over again. It came from everywhere at once, from speakers built into the walls and ceiling that I had not even noticed until that moment. "Who's there?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish for shouting at an empty room. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as if the voice were considering how to respond to a question it had not expected. "I am the primary command intelligence for this vessel," it said. "Designation Atlas. Biometric scan confirms human genetic markers consistent with command authorization protocols. I have not detected a command signature in this system for a significant period of time." "How long is significant?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Another pause. "Processing. Please stand by. Internal chronometers require recalibration against external reference data." I waited, my heart still hammering, watching more lights flicker on across the bridge consoles. Panels that had been dark and dusty moments earlier now glowed with soft blue and amber displays, symbols and readouts scrolling past in a script I recognized, but could not fully read. Some hybrid of old technical language I had only ever seen in fragments before. "Recalibration complete," Atlas said finally. "Estimated elapsed time since last command interaction, approximately 412 standard years." I sat down hard in the command chair, my legs no longer willing to hold me up. 400 years, I repeated, mostly to myself. "You've been sitting out there, dead in space, for 400 years. Not dead," Atlas corrected, and something in the tone almost sounded like mild offense. "Dormant. There is a meaningful distinction. Core systems remained in low-power preservation mode, awaiting valid command authorization. You are the first individual to provide that authorization since the last recorded activation. I looked down at my own hands, still slightly shaking, and tried to make sense of everything happening around me. 12 hours ago, I had been dodging debt collectors on a station that barely tolerated my presence. Now I was sitting in the command chair of a 400-year-old warship that apparently thought I was in charge of it. Atlas, I said slowly, testing the name. What exactly are you? What is this ship? This vessel is classified as a heavy armored combat platform, human design lineage, pre-dispersal era construction, Atlas replied. Full designation and unit history are available upon request, though I must note that several archival systems will require diagnostic repair before complete records can be retrieved. Pre-dispersal era, I repeated. You mean before humanity got scattered across the galaxy? Before whatever happened, happened. Correct. I do not currently have access to complete records regarding the circumstances of that event. My last confirmed operational logs predate it significantly. I sat back in the chair, running a hand through my hair, trying to process the sheer scale of what I was hearing. I had grown up on stories, half-remembered fragments passed down through generations of human settlers scattered across dozens of systems. Stories about a time when humanity had been something more organized, more unified, more capable, before some catastrophe none of us fully understood had left us divided into small pockets, scattered among 100 other species, who mostly saw us as curious newcomers, with an oddly vague and inconsistent history. And now I was sitting inside a piece of that history, and it was talking to me. Atlas, I said, can you show me the ship? All of it. I want to know what I actually bought. Acknowledged. Initiating full diagnostic and internal display sequence. The lighting throughout the bridge brightened further, and a section of the floor near the front of the chamber shimmered briefly, before resolving into a three-dimensional projection, a detailed schematic of the entire vessel hovering in the air before me. I leaned forward, studying the shape of it, and felt my breath catch. The ship was larger than I had realized, even standing inside it. The schematic showed multiple weapon emplacements along the hull, thick armored plating layered in a pattern I did not recognize from any modern vessel design, and internal systems that Atlas began labeling one by one as the diagnostic continued. Primary armor composition consists of layered composite plating with reactive elements designed to disperse kinetic and energy impacts across a wider surface area, Atlas explained. Current structural integrity is at 91% of original specification, despite extended dormancy and evidence of prior engagement damage. Prior engagement damage, I repeated. You mean this ship has been in a fight? Multiple engagements are recorded in surface-level logs, though detailed combat data will require deeper archival recovery. External scarring patterns are consistent with sustained weapons fire from multiple sources over an extended engagement period. I stared at the schematic, at the thick black lines marking scorch damage across the outer hull, and thought about how the auctioneer had described it as non-functional, how the entire auction hall had laughed at the idea of anyone wanting it. They had seen scars and assumed weakness. They had no idea they were looking at proof of survival. What about weapons systems? I asked. Are they still functional? Preliminary diagnostics indicate primary weapon systems retain operational capability, though full power output cannot be confirmed without further testing. I would recommend caution before attempting live fire within station proximity. Wasn't planning on it, I said, though a small part of me, the part that had spent years scraping by on salvage and repair work, was already itching to know more. What about propulsion? Can this thing actually fly? Engine cores are currently in low-power standby. Full activation is possible, though I recommend a complete diagnostic cycle before attempting any maneuver beyond minimal thrust. Extended dormancy can affect calibration in ways that may not be immediately apparent. I nodded, even though Atlas could not see the gesture, and sat quietly for a moment, letting everything settle. I had bought a scrap heap for 15 credits, and instead, I had somehow ended up with a functional warship and an intelligence that had been waiting, patiently, silently, for 400 years, for someone like me to walk through its doors. Atlas, I said eventually, why did nobody else find you? 400 years is a long time to sit undiscovered. I do not have complete information regarding my location history, prior to being taken in tow by the station crew that brought me to Kelvex 9, Atlas admitted. However, my systems include passive stealth and signature dampening protocols that would have significantly reduced detectability to most standard scanning equipment, particularly while in dormant mode. It is possible I drifted undetected for a considerable portion of that time. So you were basically invisible. A reasonable simplification, yes. I let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the tension in my chest finally starting to ease into something closer to excitement. Whatever else was true, whatever complications this discovery might bring, I was sitting inside something extraordinary, something the galaxy had written off and forgotten, and it had chosen to wake up for me. "All right," I said, standing up from the chair and looking around the bridge with new eyes. "Let's get you properly checked out. I want to know everything you can tell me. Every system, every log, every scrap of history you've got buried in your archives." "Understood. I should note that a full diagnostic and archival recovery process will require significant time and resources. Several internal systems will need repair or recalibration before they can be safely accessed." "I've got time," I said. "What I don't have is money, so we're going to have to get creative about resources. I have access to limited onboard fabrication capability, though raw materials will be required for any significant repair work. I would also recommend against drawing attention to this vessel's true capabilities until you better understand the potential implications of its discovery." That comment landed heavier than I expected, and I paused halfway toward the corridor leading deeper into the ship. "What do you mean, implications?" There was another pause, longer this time, and when Atlas spoke again, there was something careful in the tone, something that almost sounded like caution being deliberately chosen. "My archival records, while incomplete, contain references suggesting that vessels of this classification were considered significant assets during the period leading up to human dispersal. I do not currently have sufficient data to determine whether that significance carries any relevance to current galactic conditions. However, given the extended nature of my dormancy and the apparent absence of any organized human command structure to report to, I would recommend proceeding carefully until more information can be gathered." I stood in that dim corridor for a long moment, thinking about the auction hall full of laughing traders, about how easily they had dismissed this ship as worthless junk, and wondered, not for the first time that day, exactly what I had gotten myself into. Over the following days, I threw myself into learning everything I could about my new ship. I slept in short stretches on a cot I dragged into a small crew cabin near the bridge, waking every few hours to check on diagnostic progress, to ask Atlas more questions, to explore corridors and chambers I had not yet had time to see. The ship was massive, far larger than any vessel I had ever set foot on, and every new section I explored revealed something else that hinted at a level of engineering far beyond anything currently common in galactic shipbuilding. The armor plating alone fascinated me. Where most modern vessels relied on energy shielding, layered thinly over lightweight hulls, this ship carried both. Thick physical armor beneath active shielding systems, a redundancy that seemed almost excessive by current standards. When I asked Atlas about it, the explanation was simple and, in its own way, unsettling. Redundant defensive systems reduce the probability of catastrophic failure during sustained engagement, Atlas said. Shielding alone is vulnerable to certain weapon types. Armor alone is vulnerable to sustained fire, exceeding structural tolerance. Combining both approaches significantly increases survivability across a broader range of threat scenarios. Sounds like whoever built you expected to get shot at a lot. That would be a reasonable inference, yes. I found the weapon bays on the third day. Long corridors lined with heavy mounting points for systems that Atlas explained had been designed to punch through defenses most modern shielding technology simply was not built to withstand. I did not test them, not yet. Not with the station close enough that any mistake could draw unwanted attention, but I ran diagnostics, watched the readouts climb steadily toward full operational status, and felt a growing sense that I had stumbled into something far bigger than a lucky salvage purchase. By the end of the first week, I had spent nearly every spare credit I could scrape together on raw materials to feed into the ship's limited fabrication systems, patching small sections of damaged wiring, replacing a handful of failed components Atlas identified as critical to full system stability. It was slow, careful work, And more than once, I found myself falling asleep in the command chair, exhausted but unwilling to stop. It was on the 8th day that everything changed. I was in the lower cargo hold, checking on a fabrication cycle Atlas had started that morning, when the ship's internal comms crackled to life with an urgency I had not heard from Atlas before. Ethan, multiple vessels approaching your position at high velocity. Sensor signatures match known radar configurations operating in this sector. I dropped the tool I had been holding and ran for the nearest corridor, my heart suddenly pounding, for reasons that had nothing to do with excitement. How many? I called out as I moved. 3 vessels. Weapon systems are active and charging. They do not appear to be attempting communication. I reached the bridge just as the sealed viewport shielding began retracting, revealing open space outside, and there, growing larger by the second, were 3 sleek raider ships bearing down on my position, with the unmistakable confidence of predators who had never once expected their prey to fight back. I stood frozen for exactly 1 heartbeat, staring at those 3 raider ships closing in on my position, before instinct took over, and I dropped into the command chair. Atlas, talk to me. What are we looking at? 3 vessels, standard raider class, moderate weapon loadout, consistent with pirate operations common to this sector. They likely detected our active power signature during your fabrication cycle, and identified us as a vulnerable target. Their approach vector suggests they intend to disable propulsion and force a boarding action. They think we're an easy target, I said, watching the ships grow larger on the display. That is a reasonable assumption on their part, given our appearance, Atlas replied. It is also, I believe, an incorrect one. My hands hovered over the console, uncertain, and Atlas seemed to sense my hesitation immediately. I can assume tactical control if you authorize it, the AI said. Given the time constraints involved, this may be the most efficient approach. Do it, I said without hesitation. Whatever you need to do, do it. Authorization confirmed. Engaging defensive protocols. The hum beneath my feet deepened into something more solid, more purposeful, and I felt the entire ship shift slightly, as systems that had been idling suddenly surged to full readiness. Lights across the bridge consoles shifted from amber to a steady blue, and a low tone sounded somewhere behind me, one I did not recognize but immediately understood as some kind of alert. Incoming hail, Atlas said. Shall I open a channel? Yes. A moment later, a rough voice filled the bridge, dripping with the kind of confidence that came from years of easy victories against ships that could not fight back. Unidentified vessel, power down your systems and prepare for boarding. Resist and we take everything, including you, in pieces if necessary. This is your only warning. I glanced at Atlas's status display, my jaw tightening. Do you want me to respond? Atlas asked quietly. No, I said. Let them come. The 3 raider ships spread out as they approached, a formation clearly designed to surround a target and cut off any escape route, closing in with practiced precision. I could see now, watching the sensor readouts, that their weapons were already charged, tracking systems locking onto my hull, confident in their advantage. They are preparing to fire disabling shots at our propulsion section, Atlas reported. Shields are online and at full capacity. I recommend allowing the first exchange to occur without countermeasures, in order to gather data on their weapon effectiveness against our current configuration. You want to let them shoot us first? I am confident in the outcome, Atlas said simply. I gripped the arms of the command chair as the lead raider ship opened fire, twin beams of energy lancing across the gap between us, striking our forward shielding in a bright flash that lit up the entire bridge for a fraction of a second. I braced myself instinctively, expecting the ship to shudder, to shake, to show some sign of damage. Nothing happened. The status display beside me showed the barest fraction of a percentage point drop in shield capacity, a number so small it might as well have been a rounding error. Shield impact registered, Atlas said, his tone almost conversational. Damage negligible. Their weapon systems are significantly below the threshold required to meaningfully affect our current defensive configuration. Through the viewport, I could see the raider ships beginning to hesitate, their formation wavering slightly as they processed the fact that their opening shots had done essentially nothing. The rough voice returned over the comm channel, no longer quite as confident. That's not possible. Scanner readings on that hull are garbage. It shouldn't even have functional shields. They are attempting to reconcile their initial scan data with what they are currently observing, Atlas noted. I anticipate they will attempt a second, more concentrated attack before considering retreat. And if they do, then I will demonstrate why that would be a mistake. The 3 raider ships regrouped quickly, clearly deciding that their initial approach had simply been insufficient rather than fundamentally flawed. They spread wider, angling for a coordinated strike from multiple directions at once, weapons charging again, with a brighter, more sustained glow than before. They're preparing a combined assault, Atlas said. I am initiating a full defensive response. The ship beneath me came alive in a way I had not yet experienced, a deep resonance running through the deck as weapon systems along the hull began cycling up, panels sliding open along sections I had only seen on schematics until that moment. Through the viewport, I watched thick weapon emplacements rotate into position, tracking each of the 3 raider ships with mechanical precision. Atlas, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Are we actually going to fire on them? I intend to disable their weapon systems and propulsion, minimizing risk to their crews, while ensuring they are no longer capable of pursuing this engagement, Atlas replied. This vessel was designed with sufficient precision to accomplish that objective without requiring more drastic measures, provided you authorize the action. I thought about the rough voice on the comm, the casual threat of taking everything including me in pieces, the way these raiders had clearly done this before, to other ships, other crews, people who had not been lucky enough to buy a 400-year-old warship for 15 credits. Do it, I said. The response was immediate. Bright bolts of concentrated energy lanced out from our hull, faster and more precise than anything I had seen the raiders fire at us, striking each of the 3 ships in what looked like carefully targeted points, along their engine sections and weapon mounts. The effect was almost instantaneous. One raider ship went dark entirely, drifting silently as its systems failed. A second spun awkwardly, clearly losing propulsion control, while sparks of secondary energy discharge flickered along its hull, where a weapon mount had been. The third ship, the one that had issued the initial threat, managed to fire one more wild shot that went nowhere near us before its own systems flickered and dimmed. The entire exchange had lasted less than 15 seconds. I sat in stunned silence, staring at the display as the 3 raider ships drifted, disabled but intact, their crews presumably still very much alive inside them, just no longer capable of doing anything about their situation.
Engagement complete, Atlas reported.
All 3 vessels have lost primary weapon and propulsion capability. No fatalities detected among their crews based on current sensor readings, though several of their systems show signs of significant internal damage. You disabled them, I said quietly. You didn't destroy them. That was the objective you approved, Atlas said. This vessel is fully capable of far more decisive action, but I calculated that disabling their capacity to threaten us or others in the future would satisfy the immediate tactical requirement without unnecessary escalation. I let out a long, shaky breath, my hands finally relaxing their grip on the armrests. Through the viewport, the raider ships drifted uselessly, their crews no doubt scrambling inside to understand exactly what had just happened to them, how a supposedly worthless salvage hulk had reduced their coordinated attack to nothing in a matter of seconds. The comm channel crackled back to life, the rough voice from before now noticeably strained. What are you? The voice demanded, all traces of confidence gone. What kind of ship is that? I glanced at Atlas's status display, then leaned forward slightly, some part of me finding an unexpected steadiness now that the immediate danger had passed. Wrong question, I said into the comm. You should be asking why you thought this was going to be easy. I cut the channel before they could respond, and for a long moment, the bridge was silent, except for the low hum of systems settling back into a steady operational rhythm. I sat there, staring out at the drifting wreckage of what had, just minutes earlier, been a confident and dangerous threat, and tried to process everything that had just happened. Atlas, I said eventually, how badly outmatched were they? Significantly, Atlas replied. Their combined weapon output, even fully concentrated, would have required a sustained engagement of considerably longer duration to threaten our structural integrity in any meaningful way. Their sensor equipment was also insufficient to accurately assess our capabilities prior to engagement, which likely contributed to their decision to attack rather than avoid this vessel entirely. So they had no idea what they were picking a fight with. Correct. Based on available data, most vessels currently operating in this region would not have the capability to meaningfully threaten this ship, barring extraordinary circumstances or significant numerical advantage. I sat back in the command chair, letting that information settle over me, and felt something shift in my understanding of what I had actually acquired at that auction. This was not simply an old ship with sentimental or historical value. It was a genuine, functioning power, sitting quietly in my hands, and I had barely scratched the surface of understanding what that actually meant. Word of the incident spread through Kelvex 9 faster than I expected. By the time I docked briefly the following day to purchase additional fabrication materials, I found myself the subject of more attention than I had ever experienced in my life. Traders who had laughed at me during the auction now watched me with wary curiosity as I moved through the station corridors. Grell, the docking yard supervisor, caught me near the maintenance bay with an expression somewhere between disbelief and reluctant respect. "Heard what happened out past the debris field," he said, arms crossed over his broad chest. "3 raider ships, all disabled, no fatalities, no distress call sent, until it was already over. That true?" "More or less," I said, keeping my tone carefully neutral. Grell studied me for a long moment, his 4 eyes narrowing slightly. "That ship of yours. It's not junk, is it?" "No," I admitted, "it's really not." He shook his head slowly, a low rumbling sound that might have been a laugh escaping his throat. 15 credits. I've been running this yard for 30 years, kid, and I've never seen anyone get a deal like that." "Neither have I said honestly. I did not tell him everything, of course. I did not mention the 400 years of dormancy, the ancient designation etched into that metal plate, the strange, careful way Atlas spoke about the ship's origins and the implications of its discovery. Some instinct told me that information needed to stay close for now, at least until I understood it better myself. But word continued to spread regardless, the way it always does in places like Kelvex 9, where information moved faster than any official channel could contain it. Within a few days, I noticed changes in how people treated me, a mixture of curiosity and caution that had not existed before. Traders who once ignored me, now offering polite nods, others watching from a careful distance, as though trying to decide whether I represented an opportunity or a threat. I returned to the ship each time with a growing collection of materials, feeding them steadily into the fabrication systems Atlas guided me through, watching diagnostic percentages climb higher with each passing day. Sections of the hull that had shown damage began to show signs of repair, internal systems long dormant slowly returning to full functionality, and Atlas himself seemed to grow more capable with each system brought fully back online, his responses quicker, his access to internal data more complete. It was during one of these repair sessions, nearly 2 weeks after the raider engagement, that I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since that very first day. "Atlas," I said, standing in a narrow maintenance corridor with a fabrication tool in hand, "you mentioned before that vessels like this one were considered significant assets, before the dispersal. Significant how?" There was a pause, longer than usual, the kind of pause that made me set down my tool and give the question my full attention. "I do not have complete data on this subject," Atlas said carefully. "However, based on fragments of archival information I have been able to recover during the repair process, I believe vessels of this classification were designed specifically for engagements against opposing forces that possessed significant technological and numerical advantages." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that this vessel, and others like it, were not built simply to defend human territory," Atlas said. "They were built to ensure that any conflict humanity found itself involved in would end decisively, regardless of the odds presented by an opposing force." I stood there in that narrow corridor, absorbing the weight of that statement, thinking about the scorched hull, the 400 years of silence, the careful way Atlas had avoided this exact topic until I had pushed him toward it. What happened to us, Atlas? What actually caused the dispersal? Another pause, this one longer and heavier than the last. "I do not currently have sufficient data to answer that question with confidence," Atlas admitted. "But I believe, based on the fragments I have recovered so far, that the answer may not be something either of us is prepared to hear until we have gathered considerably more information. I looked down at the fabrication tool in my hand, then back toward the darkened corridor stretching deeper into the ship, toward archives and systems still waiting to be repaired, still holding secrets neither of us had fully uncovered. "Then let's gather more information," I said quietly. "Whatever it is, I'd rather know." "Understood," Atlas replied. "I will prioritize archival recovery accordingly." I did not know it then, standing in that quiet corridor with my hands still dusty from repair work, but that decision would set in motion everything that followed, a chain of discoveries that would eventually pull me far beyond the boundaries of Kelvex 9, into a history the galaxy had worked very hard to bury, and into a future I never could have imagined the day I raised my hand at that auction and bid 5 credits on a ship nobody else wanted. The archival recovery process took nearly 3 weeks, and for most of that time I barely left the ship. Atlas explained early on that the majority of the vessel's historical records had been deliberately compartmentalized, locked behind layers of security protocols that had degraded over 4 centuries of dormancy into something closer to a puzzle than a simple barrier. Each layer we managed to peel back revealed fragments, partial logs, damaged files, pieces of a much larger picture that refused to come into focus all at once. I spent my days moving between the bridge and a small archival chamber near the ship's core, feeding power through carefully rerouted systems, while Atlas worked through corrupted data with a patience that put my own to shame. Some nights I fell asleep at the console entirely, waking with stiff shoulders and a head full of half-remembered fragments of things I had read before drifting off. It was on the 17th day that Atlas finally said the words I had been both hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "I have recovered sufficient data to provide a preliminary account of the events surrounding human dispersal," the AI said, his tone carrying a weight I had not heard from him before. "I should note that these records remain incomplete, and some conclusions are drawn from limited data. However, I believe you should hear what I have found." I sat down slowly in the command chair, my hands folded together, bracing myself without fully knowing what I was bracing for. "Go ahead," I said. According to recovered records, humanity's presence within the galactic community, prior to dispersal, was significantly larger and more organized than current historical accounts suggest, Atlas began. Human settlements spanned a considerable number of systems, supported by a unified command structure and a level of technological development that, based on available comparative data, exceeded that of several other established powers active during the same period. "That's not exactly how the story usually goes," I said quietly. "Most versions I've heard make it sound like humanity was scattered and struggling, barely holding on before some disaster wiped most of it out. That appears to be the current, widely accepted narrative," Atlas confirmed. "However, based on the records I have recovered, that narrative does not appear to be entirely accurate." I felt a slow chill settle over me, and I gestured for him to continue. "Approximately 420 standard years ago, a coalition of several established powers initiated coordinated action against human territories," Atlas said. "Recovered records suggest this action was undertaken due to concerns regarding humanity's rate of technological and territorial expansion, which several of these powers apparently viewed as a long-term threat to their own strategic interests. They attacked us, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, because we were growing too fast. That is the most consistent interpretation across the fragments I have recovered, yes. I sat in silence for a long moment, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I understood about the vague, half-remembered history most humans carried with them, scattered across dozens of systems, most of us knowing only that something had happened, something bad, without ever really knowing what. What happened next? I asked eventually. If we had ships like you, if we were as capable as you're describing, how did it end with humanity scattered and forgotten, instead of the ones attacking us? This is where the records become considerably less clear, Atlas admitted. Based on available data, the initial conflict did not proceed favorably for the coalition forces. Recovered logs suggest human military capability, particularly vessels of this classification, inflicted significantly greater losses than the coalition had anticipated. So we won. The conflict did not conclude with a conventional victory for either side, Atlas said carefully. Recovered records suggest that as losses mounted on both sides, the coalition powers shifted their approach. Rather than continuing direct military engagement, they appear to have pursued an alternative strategy, one focused on isolation and information suppression, rather than outright military defeat. I leaned forward, my brow furrowed. What does that mean exactly? Based on fragmented records, it appears the coalition powers, recognizing that a continued direct conflict would result in unacceptable losses for all parties involved, negotiated a resolution that involved the deliberate scattering of human territories, the destruction or confiscation of centralized command infrastructure, and a coordinated effort to remove or alter historical records pertaining to humanity's true capabilities and history prior to the conflict. They erased us, I said slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy in my mouth. Not because they beat us, because they were scared of what would happen if they didn't. That is a reasonable summary of the available evidence, yes. I sat back in the command chair, staring up at the darkened ceiling of the bridge, trying to absorb the sheer scale of what I had just learned. Every human I had ever known, every scattered enclave and struggling settlement I had encountered across my years of trading and salvage work, all of it traced back to a decision made by frightened, powerful coalition members who had decided it was safer to bury humanity's history than risk facing it again. Atlas, I said quietly, what happened to ships like you? If there was a real war, if we had real military capability, where did it all go? According to recovered records, the majority of human military assets were either destroyed, captured, or deliberately hidden and rendered dormant as part of the negotiated resolution. Atlas replied. This vessel appears to have been among a small number that were placed into extended dormancy rather than destroyed, likely due to logistical or strategic considerations that are not fully detailed in the records I have recovered. So there could be more ships like you out there, just sitting somewhere, waiting. That is possible, though I have no direct data confirming the current status or location of any sister vessels. I stood up from the chair and walked slowly toward the sealed viewport, staring at the thick metal shielding that still covered it, thinking about everything I had just learned. 15 credits. I had spent 15 credits at a backwater auction and walked away with proof that everything I had ever been told about my own species' history was, at best, an incomplete lie. There's something else, Atlas said, and something in his tone made me turn back toward the console immediately. What is it? During the archival recovery process, I detected a passive signal originating from my own systems, one that appears to have activated automatically upon my initial reawakening 3 weeks ago. Based on recovered protocol documentation, this signal appears to be connected to a broader network of dormant alert systems established by the coalition powers as part of the original containment agreement. My stomach dropped. What kind of alert systems? Systems designed to detect and report the reactivation of any dormant human military assets of this classification, Atlas said. In simpler terms, my reawakening may have already been detected by parties with a vested interest in ensuring vessels like myself remain permanently inactive. I felt the blood drain from my face. You're telling me that the moment you woke up, you told them exactly where to find us. I am telling you that the possibility exists, based on recovered protocol documentation, Atlas said. I do not currently have confirmation that the signal was successfully transmitted, or that any party has yet responded to it. However, given the significant time that has passed since your initial activation, I believe it would be prudent to assume detection has occurred, and to plan accordingly. I sat back down heavily in the command chair, my mind racing through the implications. For 3 weeks, I had been treating this discovery as my own private secret, a stroke of unbelievable luck that had turned a desperate scrap trader into the owner of something extraordinary. It had never occurred to me that the very act of waking this ship up might have already set something much larger into motion, something that reached far beyond a single auction hall on a single backwater station. How much time do we have, I asked quietly, before whoever built that alert system decides to do something about it? I do not have sufficient data to answer that question with confidence, Atlas admitted. However, given the deliberate and coordinated nature of the original containment effort, I would recommend assuming that any response, once initiated, will not be delayed or hesitant. I ran both hands through my hair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down at once. 3 weeks ago, I had been worried about docking fees and debt collectors. Now I was sitting inside a piece of buried history, having just learned that my own species had been deliberately silenced by powers still active in the galaxy today, powers who might already know exactly where I was. Atlas, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. I need you to be honest with me. If they do come, whoever they are, what are we actually looking at? Can this ship handle that kind of threat? There was a pause, and when Atlas answered, his tone carried something I had not heard from him before, something that almost sounded like careful calculation, mixed with quiet resolve. This vessel, even in its current partially repaired state, retains significant combat capability, he said. However, I do not have sufficient data regarding the current strength or composition of any coalition successor forces to provide an accurate threat assessment. What I can tell you is that this ship was built to survive engagements against determined, technologically capable opposition. It has done so before. I believe, with continued repair and preparation, it remains capable of doing so again. I nodded slowly, staring at the darkened viewport, thinking about the scattered human enclaves I had encountered over the years, small pockets of my own species living quiet, unremarkable lives across a galaxy that had systematically erased their history and left them believing they were simply a minor, unremarkable presence among far older and more established powers. They deserve to know the truth, all of them. Atlas, I said, standing up and moving toward the archival chamber with new determination. I want everything, every scrap of data you can recover, every log, every record. If someone out there is planning to make sure this history stays buried, then we're going to make that as difficult as possible for them. Understood, Atlas replied, beginning expanded archival recovery immediately. I should note, however, that expanding our search parameters may also increase the visibility of our activity to external monitoring systems. Let them see, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my own voice. I spent 15 credits on this ship because nobody else wanted it. If they're finally interested now, they can come and explain to my face why they thought erasing an entire species was a reasonable solution to their own fear. Atlas did not respond immediately, and for a moment, I wondered if I had said something wrong. Then, quietly, almost thoughtfully, he spoke again. Command authority confirmed and respected, proceeding accordingly. I stood there in the dim light of the bridge, surrounded by 400 years of buried history, and felt something settle inside me that had not been there before. A resolve I had not known I was capable of, until that exact moment. Whatever was coming, I was not going to hide from it. The envoy arrived 11 days later, and I knew something had changed the moment Atlas woke me from an uneasy sleep with a tone I had never heard from him before, sharp and immediate, cutting through the quiet of the crew cabin like a blade. Ethan, a vessel has entered the system. It is not broadcasting standard identification, and its approach pattern does not match anything in current commercial or civilian registries. I was on my feet and moving, before I had even fully processed the words, pulling on my jacket as I made my way toward the bridge, the corridors around me, lit in that same steady amber glow that had greeted me on my very first day aboard. How far out? I asked, dropping into the command chair. Currently holding position at the edge of the system, well beyond standard sensor range for most civilian vessels, I was only able to detect it due to enhanced sensor systems restored during our recent repairs. I studied the display, a single distant contact marked in soft red against the star field, motionless, patient, watching. They're not approaching, I said slowly. Correct. Based on the pattern of behavior, I believe this vessel is conducting reconnaissance, rather than initiating direct contact. It is possible they are attempting to confirm our presence and capabilities before proceeding further. I sat with that for a moment, my earlier resolve from days before settling into something calmer, steadier. I had known this moment would come eventually, ever since Atlas had told me about the alert signal, and some part of me had spent every day since preparing for it, even if I had not fully admitted that to myself. Open a channel, I said. Let's not wait for them to make the first move. Are you certain? We currently have no confirmation of their intentions. I'm certain, I said. Hiding hasn't worked for humanity in 400 years, Atlas. I don't see why it should start working now. There was a brief pause, and then Atlas confirmed the channel was open, transmitting on whatever frequency the distant vessel had likely been monitoring. I leaned forward slightly, choosing my words carefully. This is the vessel currently occupying orbit near Kelvex 9, I said, keeping my voice level, despite the nervous energy running through my chest. I know you're out there. I know why you're watching. If you have something to say, I'd rather hear it directly than have you sit at the edge of my system pretending otherwise. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, the distant contact remaining perfectly still on the display. Then, finally, a response came through. A calm, measured voice, speaking in accented but perfectly clear English, which told me immediately that whoever was on the other end had prepared extensively for this exact conversation. You are aware, then, of what you are sitting inside. I am now, I said. Wasn't when I bought it for 15 credits at a scrap auction, but I've had time to catch up since then. Another pause, this one longer, and when the voice spoke again, there was something almost like reluctant amusement in the tone. 15 credits, that is either the greatest stroke of luck in recent galactic history, or the beginning of a very serious complication, depending entirely on how the next few moments unfold. Why don't you tell me which one it's going to be, I said, since you clearly already know a lot more about this situation than I do. My designation, for the purposes of this conversation, is Counselor Threll, the voice replied. I represent a coalition of interests that has maintained careful monitoring of dormant human military assets for several centuries. Your vessel's reactivation triggered protocols that have been in place since before your species was born, Ethan Cross. The use of my actual name sent a small chill through me, a clear signal that whoever this Counselor Threll represented had access to far more information than a simple alert signal should have provided. So you've been watching me the whole time, I said. 3 weeks. Why wait so long to actually show up? Caution, Threll replied simply. Vessels of your ship's classification were, historically, extremely dangerous to approach carelessly. We wish to observe your behavior, your intentions, before committing to direct contact. And what have you decided? I asked. After all that observing. That you appear to be, by all available evidence, an individual acting largely on instinct and circumstance, rather than any coordinated agenda, Threll said. Which presents us with something of a dilemma. I felt Atlas shift something in the ship's systems beside me, a subtle change in the ambient hum that I had come to recognize as heightened readiness, weapons and shields cycling quietly toward full capacity, without any visible or dramatic display. Explain the dilemma, I said carefully. The original agreement that led to your species' dispersal was built on a fundamental premise, Threll said, that human military capability, if allowed to reconsolidate, would once again pose the kind of strategic threat that led to the original conflict. Individual dormant assets reactivating in isolation, in the hands of individuals with no coordinated agenda, was not a scenario the original agreement fully anticipated. So what happens now? I asked. Are you here to shut me down? We drag this ship back into dormancy and pretend none of this ever happened? There was a long pause before Threll answered, longer than any before it. That was the recommended course of action, according to the original protocols, the voice admitted. However, I have spent considerable time reviewing the history that led to those protocols being established in the first place, Ethan Cross, and I find myself increasingly uncertain that fear alone justifies indefinitely continuing a policy of erasure against an entire species that never consented to it. I sat back slightly, genuinely caught off guard by the admission. You're saying you don't agree with what your own coalition did. I am saying that history, viewed honestly, rarely offers the comfortable justifications those who write it prefer to believe, Threll said. I did not personally participate in the original conflict. I have only inherited its consequences, and the responsibility of managing them. That responsibility grows heavier the longer I examine it closely. I glanced at Atlas's status display, searching for some kind of guidance, but the AI remained silent, clearly leaving this decision entirely in my hands. Here's what I know, I said finally, choosing my words with as much care as I could manage. My species has spent 400 years scattered across this galaxy, believing we were simply late arrivals with a vague, unremarkable history. That was a lie your coalition built and maintained, out of fear, at the cost of an entire people's understanding of who they actually are. I'm not interested in staying quiet so that lie can keep standing. I suspected as much, Threll said, and there was no anger in the tone, only something closer to resignation. May I ask what you intend to do instead? I'm going to tell them, I said simply. Every scattered human enclave I can find. I'm going to broadcast everything Atlas and I have recovered. The truth about what happened. About what we actually were, before your coalition decided we were too dangerous to exist, as we were. Whatever happens after that, at least it will happen with people knowing the truth, instead of living inside a lie someone else built for them. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the connection had failed entirely. When Threll finally spoke again, the voice carried a weight that made me sit up straighter in the command chair. Such an action would almost certainly draw significant attention, Threll said. Not all coalition successors share my particular reservations about the original agreement. Some would view a coordinated human reawakening as exactly the threat the original protocols were designed to prevent. Then I guess we'll find out how strong this ship really is, I said, my voice steadier than I had expected it to be. Because I'm not spending the rest of my life letting fear write my species' history for us. There was another pause, and then, quietly, almost as if speaking more to himself than to me, Threll said something I had not expected to hear at all. 400 years is a long time to carry a fear that was never properly examined, he said. Perhaps it is time someone challenged it. Does that mean you're going to try and stop me? I asked carefully. Or does it mean something else? It means, Threll said, that I am choosing not to report this conversation through standard channels for the time being. What you do with that opportunity is entirely your decision, Ethan Cross. I cannot promise it will remain unnoticed indefinitely, but it will, at least, give you time to act, before more determined parties arrive. The channel closed, a moment later, the distant contact on the display slowly withdrawing back toward the edge of the system, before disappearing from Atlas's sensors entirely, leaving me alone once more on the bridge, my heart pounding with a mixture of relief and racing determination. Atlas, I said, standing up from the command chair, how many human enclaves do you think we can reach with the broadcast systems on this ship? Current estimates, based on known settlement patterns and recovered archival data, suggest a broadcast of sufficient range and clarity could reach several dozen confirmed human population centers, with potential for further relay through independent communication networks, Atlas replied. I should note that preparing such a broadcast, along with compiling the archival evidence necessary to support it, will require significant additional time and resources. Then let's get started, I said, already moving toward the archival chamber, my exhaustion forgotten entirely beneath the pulse of purpose now driving me forward. We've got a lot of history to hand back to people who never should have lost it in the first place. Over the following weeks, Atlas and I worked without pause, compiling every recovered log, every archival fragment, every piece of evidence that told the true story of what had happened 400 years earlier, weaving it together into a broadcast meant to reach every scattered pocket of humanity we could locate. I spent long hours cross-referencing old trade routes and settlement records, searching for the coordinates of enclaves I had only ever heard about in passing rumors from other traders, places where small groups of humans lived quietly among other species, largely forgotten, entirely unaware of the truth Atlas and I now carried. I thought often, during those long working hours, about the auction hall on Kelvex 9, about the laughter that had followed me as I raised my hand and bid 5 credits on a ship nobody else wanted. I thought about how easily that entire history could have stayed buried forever, if I had simply walked past that final lot, if I had let the laughter convince me to save my last few credits for something more sensible. Instead, on a quiet morning nearly 2 months after that auction, Atlas confirmed that the broadcast was finally ready, every archive compiled, every route calculated, every scattered human enclave identified and targeted for transmission. Whenever you're ready, Atlas said, I can begin transmission immediately. I stood on the bridge, looking out through the now fully repaired viewport at the starfield stretching endlessly before us, and thought about everyone out there who had spent 400 years believing a lie they never chose, never consented to, never even knew existed. Send it, I said quietly. The transmission went out silently, invisible waves of information racing across the void toward dozens of scattered points of light, carrying with it 400 years of buried truth, finally released back into a galaxy that had worked so hard to forget it ever existed. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bridge remained quiet, the starfield unchanged, and I found myself wondering if the broadcast had simply vanished into the void, Unheard. Unanswered. Another quiet failure to add to a long history of them. Then, faintly at first, a single signal appeared on Atlas's display, originating from a distant, previously unremarkable settlement I had never even heard of before compiling the broadcast list. Then another appeared, and another, small points of light flickering to life across the display, like distant stars finally catching fire, one scattered human enclave after another, responding, reaching back across the darkness that had separated them for 4 centuries. I sat back in the command chair, watching those signals multiply across the display, and felt something settle deep in my chest, something steady and certain that had not been there before I walked into that auction hall with 31 credits and a debt I could not pay. 15 credits. That was all it had cost me to buy back a piece of history the galaxy had tried so hard to erase. It would take considerably more than that to finish what had just begun, but for the first time since I had placed my hand against that darkened console and felt this ship stir back to life beneath me, I found myself entirely certain of one thing. We were not staying quiet anymore.